I want more card buffs, and I got some pretty crazy ideas for them.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
That's right, folks. About a year ago, we got the Rise of the Mech event, which went back and it buffed a bunch of cards from the Boomsday Project expansion. Some of those were impactful. Things like Crystology going down to 1 mana was nuts. Others really didn't make much difference. But I thought it'd be fun to go back and revisit the expansions from last year, Rise of Shadows, Saviors of Doom, and Descent of Dragons, see if there were any cards that I wanted to buff. And in particular in this video, we're going to cover Rise of Shadows and get to the rest of those in future videos. But I've proposed 8 card buffs here across the neutral set and a variety of classes that I think could have some pretty cool impacts on how we see Hearthstone today. Now, before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsor for this video. If you don't know Shadowverse, it's a great card game many Regis Gilpin fans enjoy. It's free to play, mobile and PC, and it's back with a mini expansion launching today, May 20th, with 17 new cards, adding to a fantastic roster of tons of cool things to play. You can check out Shadowverse in the description below to learn more and see those new cards in action.
The seeds of destruction will uproot this world no longer.
Yeah, new cards and changes can certainly infuse some life into a game, and that's what I'd like to see in Hearthstone with something like this. Dr. Boom's Scheme, widely considered one of the worst cards ever in Hearthstone. And the base version, you know, it was just 4 mana, gain some usually pretty small amounts of armor, like 4 or 5. You know, I've seen this get to 10, 15. Even then, it doesn't feel like this hugely impactful card. And of course, that takes 15 turns of it being in your hands, not even in deck. So nobody really has ever played Dr. Boom's Scheme seriously. But I think there'd be a really easy way to fix this. If you gave it something that reacted to your opponent's resources and actually gave it a resource neutral game plan by allowing it to remove a minion by dealing damage to a minion that also scales, Dr. Boom's Scheme would be totally fine. Because here's the problem, right? You get to the end of a game, your opponent has an 8/8 on board. Even if you gained 30 armor off of Dr. Boom's Scheme, if that's your last card, that 8/8's still going to kill you. It's a resource that you're spending to buy time, but not to actually meet up with your opponent's resources. It doesn't challenge their resources. So you go basically 0 for 1, and they'd rather just run an extra piece of removal instead. But if you bundle that Dr. Boom Scheme removal in, then the card makes way more sense. And I like the idea of this scaling damage to a minion as well. So, you know, I think probably after 4 turns, this version of Dr. Boom Scheme looks like a bash, for instance, deal 3, gain 3. And it becomes a pretty neat card. Like if this said deal 8, gain 8 armor, that would be awesome for 4 mana. That'd be pretty insane. So I think this is a really easy tweak that makes this card a resource check instead of just a stall. This kind of doubles the acceleration of Dr. Boom's Scheme and helps it keep things reasonable from a resource standpoint. So all in all, this would be a pretty simple change that would make this a really fun, viable card. So now let's move on to one that's probably going to be a little more controversial. I'm aware of that. This is Thoradal the Star's Fury, the token weapon you get off of Varisa Windrunner. I'm particularly partial to this card because it's the one I revealed. I had to open that puzzle box live on stream, which was totally stupid and insane. Everybody was waiting on me like a fool. But those traumatic memories aside, I think Varisa could actually be pretty good if you turned Thoradal into this sort of impending doom Malygos kind of card. Right now, Thoradal, when you attack, you get +2 spell damage. That's pretty cool, but it goes away at the end of the turn. But what if that spell damage stuck around? What if it stacked up? So after the first attack, you have 2 that's attached to the weapon. After the second attack, you get 4 spell damage attached to the weapon. And then finally, after the third attack, you'd have +6 spell damage attached to your weapon, much like a Malygos. But it would be a Malygos that your opponent could see and would take 3 turns and would still be susceptible to weapon removal. So it wouldn't be this kind of like unavoidable situation like many Malygos combos are. Your opponent would have visibility and reaction, but if they didn't find those answers, or if they didn't manage to dedicate their deck to answering it, it could still serve as this really cool combo enabler, and it would give Varisa at least some potential, like, this is gonna work. Whereas you play Varisa right now, it feels like it's almost never gonna work because it still has the same susceptibility to weapon removal as it would with this new version, but it just doesn't feel like the sky is the limit, right? It feels like it has a pretty natural cap to it. And I think you need to have that potential. You need to be able to stretch it further. You need to be able to hope for the win for this one to make sense and to spend 7 mana playing something like Farisa. So taking those limits off the card, giving it that like Malagos potential would really help you commit to building a deck around it. I still, for the record, don't think this would be all that powerful, just because weapon removal would be such an easy answer, particularly with cards like Zephrys in the meta. They can just drop you an acidic swamp ooze at any time. So I don't even think this would necessarily make the card good or, you know, meta relevant, but it would make it more fun and more reliable in a way, or at least more predictable, and you'd have that hope that I think currently doesn't exist. So moving on now to Violet Spellsword. I always thought this was a really cool card, and it feels like one of those things that's like maybe kind of a competitive anyway if somebody just figured out the right list for it. Like, could you toss this in a Spell Druid right now and have, you know, like an 8/6 on turn 4? Is that good? Like, maybe, but I thought, why not just like guarantee that this could work in a very spell-centric deck by making the buff symmetrical instead of one way, right? So before we've had like Twilight Drake, which it gets big health, which makes a lot of sense. Clearly, that's been a card that succeeded. Violet Spellsword went the other way, had a capped health total, but could get big attack. Well, what if both could just get really big, right? What if you had 9 spells in hand when you play your Violet Spellsword, and it becomes a 4-mana 10/10? That's pretty cool, right? Like suddenly, oh my god, is that a problem? I don't think it's a huge problem because first off, right, deck construction's tough to have 9 spells in hand. You'd have to draw all those spells. You'd have to hit your Violet Spellsword. Frankly, at that stage, it's pretty similar to the cards like Mountain Giant of old, where you played an 8/8 on a full hand. It doesn't feel that much stronger. Often this would be like a 7/7 or an 8/8. But I think this has even more checks on it, right? Because of that deck construction aspect where you have to have enough spells. And often a natural hand in Hearthstone would have probably half and half spells and minions. So this might be, more realistically, a 5/5, a 6/6, occasionally stretch into that 7/7 territory. Even if you build your deck with this pretty heavy spell focus, it's still going to be like 7/7, 8/8 kind of thing, unlike other options. And it still has the hand size limitations of something like Mountain Giant, right? Where if you don't have enough cards, you only have 5 or 6 in hand, this might only be a 4/4, right? So it doesn't scale necessarily well as you begin to empty your hand into the late game. So I think this would be a cool alternative. It would really help you focus into this style of play where you've got these big spell-heavy things. You couldn't go all spells or no minions, clearly, and like a no minion mage would have trouble running this because it's a minion. So there are natural checks and balances in place for these kinds of cards. But I like this idea of making it symmetrical, giving you this really big potential spike. And this card just has like such a cool artwork, and I like the name of it. I just want this card to work and be good. So if you think this is overpowered, certainly let me know in the comments. I think it'd be okay, and I think this would be a really fun spin on the card. So moving on here to Tack Nas Whisker. I have a card where I didn't change the mechanics at all. I just changed the numbers, and I think it makes Tack Nas Whisker really viable. The problem with Tack right now is how expensive he is. It's so hard to commit 7 mana for just a 6/6 body and some resources in hand that usually you don't even have the mana to cast. So like Tack Nas Whisker plus your Togwaggle scheme seems like a cool play, but anything you Togwaggle scheme is going to be really hard to get off. But at 4 mana, you get some pretty interesting breakpoints where you could say Tack Nos Whisker, Togwaggle scheme, that's 5 mana, and you'd have 5 mana remaining to still play whatever thing you scheme. So if you schemed like a Convincing Infiltrator, for instance, boom, you can drop the Convincing Infiltrator right away. It just gives you more flexibility. Even if you don't, play the thing that you get immediately added to hand, you might have the mana left over to drop some Eviscerates or some kind of board reactive card so that you don't just totally die when you play Tack. Because he doesn't need to be big, right? This is a kind of a trick card, a card that's about shenanigans, not about like onboard presence. So just make him small. Who cares? I don't think this effect would be like insanely overpowered either if Tack is small. Like, it's nice to get some extra resources in hand, but not game-breaking, because you still have to spend mana, you still have to play them. Compared to things like Galakron, where it's drawing all these cards that are 0 mana, a 4-mana attack feels completely fine, but at least it would have an option to be played. It would give these kind of shenanigan, infinite value rogues more viability, which, I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily good for the game, but I certainly think it's really fun to play that style of deck. So for me, this is an easy fix to Tack. I think it'd be a really fun fix as well. If you want to make it 5 mana, you want to make it a 4/4, I don't care. Just pull the numbers down enough that you have spare mana at any given turn, and this card becomes way more interesting. So next up here is Vicious Scrap Hound, a card I was rooting for so hard. I think I gave it like a really good score in reviews. It just made so much sense to me in the magnetic world. Like, oh my god, so much armor. But Warrior never really needed it despite having all those mech builds, which still kind of blows my mind. I don't know how this one slipped through the cracks. But to make it good, it needs to be really good now because, of course, Magnetic and all the mechs have already rotated out of standard format. But I think you can still do that by flipping the way that it gains its armor. Instead of when it deals damage, what if it gains armor by the amount of damage that it takes instead? So, for instance, if a 3/3 trades into Vicious Scrap Hound, it's going to gain you 3 armor instead of being capped at 2 for when it deals damage. Now, when it dealt damage, that made sense because Magnetic, you could kind of increase the stats on this one and it could deal more damage. Without Magnetic, I think you have to flip it for this one to ever work. Otherwise, it's got a pretty hard cap there at 2 damage. It'd be hard to buff it and manipulate it beyond that much. But when it takes damage, it becomes really cool because say your opponent like has to fireball it for some reason. Let's pretend they have fireball and they want to use it on Scrap Hound. It's going to take 6 damage and gain you 6 armor. Let's pretend it's on board and your opponent plays a Deathwing Mad Aspect and it takes a hit for 12. Well, guess what? You're going to gain 12 armor off of this 2-drop. Now, those are pretty unlikely situations, and usually I think your opponent's going to have a pretty easy way to deal with this in one fell swoop, and it's usually going to gain you 3 armor exactly, right? But there might be those instances where it does something crazy and it gains more, and I like that sort of thing, giving Warrior this early game minion that can contest the board because I bumped it up to a 2/3, so it's better at checking those early boards. It kind of has that Eternium Rover feel, but as a 2-drop instead, that can occasionally do crazy things. And sure enough, if you build your deck around this and find ways to buff it, if you give it taunt, maybe just a single Defender Vargas, could make this card really, really cool in a lot of ways. So I think this would make a card I always rooted for way more viable, a better option, even in a non-mech meta, and that is certainly something I'd be relieved to see. Next up here, we have Life Weaver for Druid, a card I've played around with a lot, trying to make things like Heal and Loosen Bark Druids work, but it's been really hard. It turns out like there's just getting enough stuff to happen when you have a Life Weaver on the board from restoring health standpoint's pretty tough. It's big commitment to build your deck around all that healing. I feel like you can only usually get like 1 or 2 procs off of Life Weaver, and the spells added to your hand rarely help you chain. Now, we've had cards in the past, things like Lyra, even now with Sethic Veil Weaver, where a lot of the times you can create chains pretty reliably, particularly with Lyra, because any spell was going to activate Lyra. Sethic Veil Weaver is a little tougher because you don't always get targeted things, but sometimes you do, and you can keep a chain going. Life Weaver, you actually very rarely get another healing spell to keep things moving. So Sethic Veil Weaver, you know, maybe has like a 50% hit rate. Lyra had a 100% hit rate. I feel like Life Weaver has something like a 10% hit rate, where if you don't already have the support in hand, it's really, really hard to get it going. But if you change it in the way I have here, where it adds a healing spell specifically to your hand, then you're very reliably going to support your healing archetype, and you're going to create chains off of Life Weaver much more easily. And you might say, well, what's a healing spell? Or you're just like, that's not very specific. That's not something that we've seen defined in Hearthstone. Actually, we have with the card Amakir the Light in the Tombs of Terror dungeon run thingy there. He also defined healing spells, and they were random healing spells from any class, which I actually think would be really cool for Life Weaver. In this case, they wouldn't just be Druid healing spells. They could be anything. So like a Siphon Soul could pop up, because that actually has a healing component. You could just get a really cheap priest healing spell like Radiance, for instance, that would be great for chaining off of Life Weaver. So I'd like to see them steal this mechanic from Amakir the Light. I mean, certainly not the way in which it triggers, but at least the payoff. Attach it to Life Weaver, create those chains, better support that healing archetype, and better support building your deck into that game plan so that Life Weaver can be this really cool value generator and can kind of go off. Whereas right now, that deck doesn't have any super powerful turns. This would give it that and help the deck get there. Moving on here to Bronze Herald. This is a card that is like, I don't know if it's like actively bad necessarily, like a lot of the cards on this list. I mean, it's kind of been played. I feel like people have tossed it into decks here and there. It's just like a mid-range card, but it never feels good to me. And that Dragon hand buff package that I think it was supposed to encourage with cards like Dragon Speaker never got there. And I think that's just because the stats on Bronze Herald are pretty measly for a 3-drop. Let's bump up the stats to 4/3. Like, I don't think this thing's crazy. I figure maybe Blizzard was worried that like having these dragons in hand and the hand buff package could scale out of control and it would be really nasty. Like, maybe that would be too good. But as we found out, like, these 4/4 dragons in hand are kind of hard to play. They don't usually feel that good. The hand buff stuff hasn't worked, so it's not like you're getting 7/7s in hand or anything. So for me, I think the death rattle is mediocre. It's not so punishing that you can't give this card just like a normal stat line. It takes a long time to get those 4/4s into play. They don't feel good when you do. Those are weak mana commitments. I think a 3/4 would probably be a little bit too sticky, and you kind of want this minions to die still. Death rattle minions, I think it feels better to align them with lower health than attack. So you're not giving yourself like the super reliable, say like Blessing of Kings buff on 4, but you're still getting a minion that can trade better, can trade up into future boards more nicely. So for me, this just makes Bronze Herald feel so much stronger than that 3/2 stat line. It was a pretty simple change, and it brings this closer to reality instead of some sort of maybe fearful like hand buff world. This is what we're playing in Hearthstone. This card makes more sense in real life, and this is an easy change that would make Paladin, a pretty weak class right now, maybe slightly more viable. And then finally here I have the Eager Underling as my last card, and I've very simply given this one Taunt. And the reason for that is right now Eager Underling is just way too hard to play, because when you put it down, like 97% of the time your opponent gets to decide when and how this thing dies, so they can often like kill off your other minions first, and then at only 2 health, it's not very hard to finish off the Eager Underling. So it very rarely ever results in any kind of buff, maybe just like 1 buff, and then it's a 4 mana 4/4, which isn't all that exciting. So it's really hard to get this thing to make sense. But if you give Eager Underling Taunt, it's far more often in minion versus minion combat going to result in buffing minions behind it. So you're not like punished playing this. Your opponent doesn't have as much free decision making to kill this last. They're in fact encouraged to kill it first. I mean, of course, they could still drop a Kobold Lackey and like snipe something behind it, that Flame Imp. So there are ways for your opponent to get around this, but more often it encourages these buffs to go off. And I actually think that's really good. Right now with Zoo Warlock, we've had this heavily 1-drop focused build where they very rarely run anything more expensive. You've got like Magic Carpet, a billion 1-drops, right? And occasionally some like Hand of Gul'dan discard stuff these days, Nightshade Matron, etc. But it's like the deck is like 16 to 18 1-drops or something insane right now. I think it'd be better if we move Zoo just a little bit back towards that, 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop on curve game plan. I'm kind of getting sick of the reliance on crazy 1-drops. A card like this, I think, would help do that. Push Zoo just a little bit more mid-range, which for me has always felt a little bit better to play against, and certainly more fun to play as well. I kind of hate being so reliant on filling up your hand with these gigantic things and buffing them with Scrap Imp. That's not as fun for me as more sort of pure on-curve minion versus minion combat. Now, I don't know if that's good enough in Hearthstone these days, but I think a card like this could help that be better. This would be a pretty neat design to encourage that slightly more mid-range build, and that's why I'd like to see Eager Underling buffed. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this video. Thanks again to Shadowverse for sponsoring this one. If you guys have cards you'd like to see buffed in Rise of Shadows, certainly leave those thoughts below. I'm also going to be doing videos for Saviors of Uldum and Descent of Dragons, so if you have ideas for those expansions, feel free to leave your thoughts. Might inspire some of my designs as well. But until then, thank you so very much for watching, and until next time, game on.